Welcome to our AirMiners event. My name is Jason Grillo with AirMiners. It's a pleasure to see you all here today. What we're doing today is talking about how small direct air capture startups and small direct air capture storage startups can match with one another, pair with one another. How do these two critical aspects of the carbon removal ecosystem, industrial ecosystem, work together? We're doing this because storage and for direct air capture is a critical function of the industry. Some see that this is a field that needs to still be unlocked a little bit more, as well as figuring out how small direct air capture startups can work with these companies, as well as what their needs are, what the opportunities lie, where the opportunities lie, and how can both of these types of new innovative organizations work with one another. With that in mind, we have the illustrious moderating skills of Adina Mangubat, AirMiners' own Accelerator Director, to lead us through the conversation. We've got 3 said direct air capture startups and 3 said storage startups keen on different methods of removing carbon from the atmosphere and storing carbon in the atmosphere, all in aid of AirMiners, the mission here in AirMiners, which is to remove the first 1 billion tons of CO2 from the atmosphere by the end of 2030. Note on logistics, per usual, we are going to have our discussion for the next 35 or 40 minutes, and then launch into Q&A with you, our audience. Feel free to ask questions in the chat. I will moderate and pass it along to Adina for those last 15 minutes or so of Q&A. I'll come on at the end with some other announcements about our next event coming up, which should be another really good one. And then we will stop the recording. The event will be over at the top of the hour at 12 noon Pacific, and we'll go into breakout rooms for those who want to stay. Everyone's busy, clearly, but we will continue on with post-event networking so that we can kind of get to know each other in a smaller environment. So with that, I just want to say once again, thank you for coming. I look forward to hearing the conversation. This is being recorded and put on our YouTube channel. So if you have to duck out early, totally get it. It will be sent to you afterwards, and we will send that and we'll provide that to your audience on our AirMiners YouTube channel. So without further ado, again, I leave you in the extremely capable hands of Adina Mangubat, who runs AirMiners' Accelerator Launchpad program. So Adina, take it away, please.
Thank you so much, Jason. Really excited to have this conversation. This was really born out of having lots of conversations with our direct air capture companies that had come out of Launchpad and our storage companies that had come out of Launchpad, and really realizing that there was a very real need for kind of an open discourse about how does this whole thing work? Like when you get down to brass tacks, how does it actually work? So we're going to have our first, our direct air capture companies introduce themselves. And so if you can say, well, let's see, we'll just do it in order of people that are on my screen. We won't necessarily have the direct air capture folks do it first. So we'll just do it in order of my screen, and I'll tell you who's who. But if we can do title, company, and what your company does in one sentence, that would be great. And Paul, you're up first.
No,
Paul from Carbon Atlantis. Sorry, there's 2 Pauls. That's ambiguous. Yeah. Paul from Carbon Atlantis. Go for it.
Thanks a lot, Adina. So yes, I'm Paul. I'm founder and CTO at Carbon Atlantis, and we developed a novel electrochemical electrolyzer for cheap acid-base mediated direct air capture.
Thank you. Okay, now other Paul.
Okay, thank you. My name is Pol Knops. I'm co-founder and CTO of Paebbl, and we are a CO2 repurposing company, storing CO2 in rocks and making cementitious material.
Great. Duncan?
Hello, everyone. My name is Duncan Kariuki. I'm product lead at Octavia Carbon, and we design, build, and will deploy direct air capture in Kenya.
Cooper?
Hey, I'm Cooper Quinn. I'm the CEO of CO2 Lock Corp, and we're focused on brucite-rich ultramafic rocks for permanent in-situ CO2 storage and ex-situ CDR, and our first project development site is here in British Columbia, Canada.
Sean?
Hi, my name is Sean Wilson, and I've been working in the DAC space for the past 9 years. and I'm currently the CEO and founder of Terrafixing, a cold weather direct air capture startup.
Great. And Claire.
Hi, I'm Claire Nelson. I'm the co-founder and CTO of Cella, and we store CO2 underground in rocks.
Great. Okay. So first question is for our director capture companies. What is it that you're looking for in a storage company partner?
I can go ahead, if you don't mind. So for us, I think the selection of the storage partner was mostly about reducing risk. Oops, oh, my light turned off. So we built our first pilot in the field in a project facilitated by Frontier. And it's a pre-purchase, so we want to also deliver the tons we promise. So we looked out for different storage partners, and for us it was important to actually be able to deliver the tons. So we partnered up with Paebbl. I think that's official now. I think what's interesting also about Paebbl process is that it's close to us. We are located in Munich. It's not too far. We can go there, visit the pilot, and Paebbl has a reactor and can deliver the storage tons in the same time frame. And then Paul can elaborate on that, but I think there's some interesting possibilities with the Paebbl process also to not only store CO2, but and apart from the carbon credits, generate other revenues.
Thanks, Paul. So it sounds like risk is one of the biggest factors. Like, you know, one of the things that's interesting about this is that we have essentially a bunch of fairly new companies having to partner with other fairly new companies, right, in order to make the whole thing work. So risk is a really big factor. And then also proximity, right? Not having to transport your captured carbon too far, because obviously that eats into the emissions that you actually can remove. Yeah.
Totally.
Okay, great. Awesome.
And one thing to add here, I think Paebbl will deliver greatly, but it's in the port of Rotterdam, so we also considered this to have like different options. If something fails in the Paebbl process, we can store it in a bottle or a tank and ship it, because the port of Rotterdam has a CO2 hub where you can ship CO2 actually. So going to Iceland, for example, going to Norway. So we also calculated some numbers on that, and yeah, took that into our consideration.
Understood. So CO2 hubs also a big consideration. For Octavia or Terrafixing, curious if there's anything else, you know, besides risk, proximity, CO2 hub locations. Is there anything else that went into your decision-making process when as you're looking for a storage partner?
If I can comment on that. Oh.
Yeah, go ahead, Sean.
Okay. I would say another thing is scale. So for instance, if you go to a sequestration partner and you're looking to sequester 100 tons of CO2, you're going to be not going to have the money and for just 100 tons of CO2 to drill a hole deep in the ground and sequester it there, right? It's you're going to have to either find partners to share that expense with, or you're going to have to figure out another solution to sequestering the CO2, like within concrete or whatnot. So it's I guess it's depending on whatever situation you're in, trying to figure out multiple pathways that'll work for you for like risk mitigation. So if you're in the small scale, try to get a couple of partners that could potentially take on your CO2. And if you're in the large scale, it ends up being a lot more of a little bit more complex, but it requires you to work really well with your storage partner and seeing if you can sequester in a site and developing that project.
So scale matching sounds like a big deal. Yeah. All right, good. Duncan, what else? Anything else you want to add that wasn't covered in those groupings?
Yeah, I think just to add on proximity, I think we generally have a preference for co-location between storage and energy, or the energy source, particularly renewable energy, just because of the considerations of the overall life cycle assessment, having to develop CO2 transport infrastructure, or having to even develop an energy source would be something that would cause massive delays in the overall project and reduce the carbon removal efficiencies.
Absolutely. Yeah. Renewable energy, reliable, very renewable energy is a big, big deal. And I'm sure it's something that the storage folks think a lot about when they're selecting location. So let's hear a little bit from the storage folks as to what should director capture companies know about what is required to work with you, or things that you think is important for them to know. Paul, you want to go first?
Okay, then I shall start. Indeed, yes. Indeed, yes, risk and scale and timing indeed is important. So there should be a match, like Paul just explained, between the scale of the DAC company and the scale of the storage company. In our case, let's say we need high pressure CO2 and some purity. So we have some discussions about pressurization. They are not main bottlenecks, so they should be handled indeed, yes, so there's no problem. And we can live with less pure CO2. So let's say the purity and the quality of the CO2 and the pressure, that's something to consider. And in our case, let's say we're also co-hosting pilot scale facilities of DAC units, because we realize quite some DAC companies out there have got lab scale facilities, but quite often they lack pilot scale facilities. So we are very happy to host them in Rotterdam. That's
great.
That also gives us more flexibility towards different clients. And let's say I don't see any competition between the DAC companies, because they have different technologies and they can fit differently. So yeah.
Understood. So risk, scale, timing, and then quality, or kind of the way that the CO2 is being delivered, with this high pressure, purity, etc. Okay, great. And then obviously co-hosting for pilot scale is really important. Okay, great. Claire, did you want to go next? It looked like you had your hand raised. Yeah.
Yes, something that nobody's said so far, sort of surprisingly, is cost. I think that we're in this luxurious time period where cost doesn't matter. There's a few number of customers that will just pay whatever for these DAC to storage, like the highest quality CDR credits possible. But I think that that's unfortunately probably not going to last forever. And a lot of the existing knowledge and projections around cost of direct air capture just kind of have this black box of like $20 a ton for transport and storage. And like not a lot of companies are in that transport and storage space that aren't oil and gas companies. So what those costs are kind of actually very uncertain. Obviously they can be cut down by some of the things mentioned already, co-locating, like logistics, energy, depending on where your sources are and how much those costs, of course. But yeah, we've had DAC companies tell us we'll pay whatever because we have customers that'll pay whatever. And we've also had DAC companies tell us, well, we budget $5 a ton for storage, so sorry. So it's a bit of a range, but I think that I think that that's, I mean, hopefully the people will just pay a premium for mineral storage forever. But I think that that's probably not going to be the case. And hopefully DAC companies can source customers that will pay for that. But again, don't think that'll last forever. But I also just wanted to underscore what Paul said about basically the just board, like baseline technical specs of what CO2, what type of CO2 we want. Like we'll take CO2 from pretty much anyone who can meet those specs. And there's different types of storage approaches that can work with different DAC technologies. For example, if you have low purity CO2 or relatively low, like 20 to 70 or 80%, like some more traditional in situ mineralization, like the water dissolved approach that is done in Iceland, Carbfix, can work really well. Some ex situ mineralization approaches where you have a reactor and you can pass low purity gas through and the mafic materials will absorb the CO2. But what we're doing at Cella is more kind of similar to traditional oil and gas type storage, where you do need pure CO2 to compress it to supercritical state. So there's also like a natural kind of filter of what technologies make sense for what storage partners that is beyond just location and everything. It's just actually like the technology needs to line up.
Yeah, it sounds like technical specs are really, really important. And so, it would be great actually if we had like a little database of like, okay, what are the technical specs for different types of storage and doing some matchmaking that way. But maybe that's a thing for another day. You mentioned costs. That's such a big topic. We're going to talk about that in a hot second, but I want to give Cooper a minute to weigh in on anything else other than risk, scale, timing, technical specs of CO2, co-hosting, cost. Anything else?
No, I think everyone's got a good handle on it there. But I think the only thing I'd add is just that really the making sure the scalability is there on both sides, and that those scales align with timing, and that everyone on both sides of the fence is pretty aware of what the risks for the other partner is at any point in time. And then, for us as a storage company, like we get quite a fair number of inbounds from DAC companies. And so making sure that we can kind of filter through those in a meaningful way. And it'd be really easy for us to go down some feed study, front end engineering with everyone that comes through the door, because maybe there's a great opportunity there. And that's not going to be a good use of everyone's time. We need to kind of be pick and choose and make sure you align with your partners.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Cooper. Well, I want to turn our sights to this question of the money, right? Because that really matters. And as Claire spoke to right now, people are willing to pay quite a premium, or there's only a certain number of buyers out there in the market that are willing to pay quite a premium for director capture plus storage, right? And there's a lot of questions about like, well, how the heck does that work? How does the carbon credit sale work? Who gets the money for that? Does somebody sell the credit and then does the revenue get split afterward? Or is the storage company buying the CO2? Is that like, how does it work? So obviously I know that there's a lot of different flavors for this. And so I'd love to just kind of hear the range of solutions that people have come up with regards to how the money actually works and flows. So who would like to take that one first?
I can go first.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question because the short answer is nobody knows. Like there's no like set way really. I mean, there kind of is. Traditionally, the capturer gets a credit. If we're talking about the US 45Q, you can either pay a storage company and essentially the storage as a service, or you can transfer the credit. But I think generally the state of the art, I guess, is for the capturer, in this case, DAC company, to claim the credit. And but we've explored different operating models at Cella, and there is kind of not a lot of precedent for other options, but there also isn't like a huge amount of precedent for the way it is, just because this is so new. So I would definitely like to see brave startups kind of expand the range of operating models beyond just DAC company sells credits, pays for storage as a service. But I don't think I've ever heard of storage companies buying the CO2 if it's just dedicated storage that's not also utilization, but maybe someone else can correct me if I'm wrong. But I think that this kind of goes back into your other question before about costs and stuff, is that a lot of DAC companies, I think right now, are looking to sell CO2 or partner with like CCU companies, just because that helps with the economics at the moment. Like a lot of DAC companies just like have to do that as a stepping stone to dedicated storage. So yeah, I think that those types of setups might have different operating models, but we will never buy CO2, but I would be curious if other people I don't want to say never say never,
Yeah.
but it's not on.
We'll take Cooper and then Sean. I'm just going based on unmuting. So Cooper and then Sean. Yeah, go ahead, Cooper.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, as Claire kind of alluded to there's a lot of different models. And I think one of the challenges is that a lot of the companies that, you know, like us and others are fairly small, and that ultimately it's a really nascent industry. And so there isn't, you know, 2 or 3 or 4 like very cut and dried models that have been used for several decades. And every piece of the puzzle is its own commercial entity at this point. And so everyone's kind of trying to navigate and figure out how best to make it work for them. But ultimately, I think what companies have to remember is the best solution for their company and profitability for their company might not be the best for a project, because you need it to work for every piece of that puzzle. And so how you split that up, as Claire alluded to, there's a lot of different ways you can do that. You can do storage as a service. You can try to, you know, divide credits and things like that. And that then plays into that kind of risk factor and equation, as well as with, you know, different commercial arrangements will give more risk to one side than the other potentially, and things like that. And that can be a real challenge. So I think there's a lot of work to be done here. And you know, part of what might help too is, much as we are our own commercial entities, but some transparency in terms of the agreements that are being done out there. And there's, you know, some precedent for that in the space with, you look at Frontier and things like that. But it's a challenge, and there's a lot of different ways to slice the pie up. But it's got to work for the project as a whole.
Thanks, Cooper. Sean?
Yeah, like I've seen a lot of business models out there for this. I have seen the storage people want the credits. There's a company in Canada I can think of. But I have also dealt with ones that are like as a service. And I've also dealt with it in terms of like contractual ability, like it being a contract in which we would get the well at the end and all of its useful assets. And so it's interesting how there's like all these different models out there. I'll have to say one thing I liked, like what I just heard, was there's this element that, you know, there's a lot of uncertainty from all the parties, especially when you're a small DAC company, and like, you know, your technology, what's going to scale up to, is your solution going to be scalable? Even the storage thing, right? There could be a lot of blindsiding things that can come up that you didn't expect, like the well pressure and whatnot. So it's I asked one of our partners about like one thing that they said that we should like really make sure we have between us, and he said it was like trust and developing that, because you as a DAC company need to be you don't want to be blindsided, and you don't want to blindside your storage partner, right? So it's like you really need to have that open and honest and clear communication between each other throughout the whole process, because it's something that we're all working together to try to get to this beautiful endpoint. And we know that it isn't going to be like super smooth sailing. There is going to be problems that are going to come, but by being open and communicating and having that trust, it's that you can actually get there together, type of thing.
Thanks,
Yeah, I
Sean.
guess I would just add one quick thing that I forgot, and I'd say there's some one thing for DAC companies to consider too, is there's some really key commercial differences between like a technology company like Claire's and you know, kind of, we're developing our first project ourselves. So that's really important, whereas kind of DAC companies operate a little bit differently. And then we did, I have to admit, we bought our first CO2 for our first injection, but that was just kind of how it had to work, and it was small scale. But that's certainly not the only plan going forward.
Fair enough. Duncan, I saw you. Oh, Duncan, then Paul.
Yeah, at Octavia, our preferred model is basically to own the carbon rights, and then just do everything behind that, which is basically developing the project. We feel that it simplifies the model, and then from that, it just pay for CO2 storage as a service. We feel that it simplifies the model for both companies, particularly where there is no other product. You know, where there could be other products other than the carbon credits. There could be other business models that make sense. But for us, we just prefer to do all the work in getting the certifying the credits and getting them to market, and doing all the sales and customer acquisition, and then paying for CO2 storage as a service.
Understood. Paul, go ahead.
Yes, so to add to that, for us it was that we sold the credits, and from that and the storage partner, but I don't think that this will be the case in the future. I think CDR or direct air capture and storage is a very nascent market. So you see a lot of young companies that try to bring something into the field and then make some money on top of it. That's very supply limited also. So you have to kind of be the technology developer. You have to build up the plant. Maybe you have to operate the plant on yourself. But I don't think that this will be in the future the case. For a company like us, we develop the technology. But we don't want to be a plant operator in the future. We will do that now because we have to show that the technology works in the field. But I think it will kind of segment in many industries. You see, for example, hydrogen, you have the electrolyzer company that produces electrolyzers. Before that, you may have companies that produce materials, membranes, electrode materials. You have a company that does the automation maybe around it and gives you the machines. You have a project developer, you have someone that finances it, and then you have someone that operates the hydrogen plant. You may have someone that transports it. So there's a long value chain. You don't see a player that does all at once. So I think we won't sell carbon credits in the future. We will do it for now, for the next years. There may be business models for direct air capture companies where you also operate your plants. But generally, I think you see a segmentation. And I believe it will be the storage company that sells the credits, a little bit like oil companies. Kind of, we will see hopefully a reversed oil industry where big project operators put CO2 underground and they know how to drill oils. They will operate these plants and then make money finally out of that and buy all the surrounding equipment they need.
So that's your prediction, is that ultimately you're not going to be the one selling the carbon credit. It's going to be the storage
I don't
companies.
have a glass ball. I don't know, but that's what I believe at least.
I mean, let's get the hot take from the storage companies. I mean, what do you guys think about that?
No, it makes sense indeed, yes. When you look at that, for instance, in Iceland, they're already having plans to ship CO2 from Europe to Iceland, to unload it and to store it there. And of course, then the project developer will be something like Carbfix, and then the CO2 will be supplied by various DAC companies. So I absolutely agree with Paul that we have in the future project developers which buy technology or equipment and find the right location to extract the CO2, and you have in due time certifiers which take care for the whole certification, and then you ship or sell or transport the CO2 either to underground storage or mineralization or whatever use. And some uses are greenhouses, which are not CO2 credits, but other uses will be permanent and will have CO2 credits. So there'll be a huge range of variants. Mm-hmm. And to very little bit elaborate that, we are cooperating with Paul, with Carbon Atlantis. We applied both, or honestly, Carbon Atlantis applied for Frontiers. We split the CO2 credits because we realized that a DAC company also needs to pay the bills and run the process. Otherwise, they can survive. In our case, we are slightly different than other mineralization companies because we're making a sellable product. So that makes our case, let's say, process-wise more challenging because we run a chemical process behind it. But from the economics, we can also sell a product instead of only be depending on the CO2 credits. That puts us a bit slightly in the CCU field and slightly in the CCS field as it is permanent. And but I agree with most, and it is also about trust indeed. Yes, we're all novel technologies with scaling up, and having people to see and to meet them and to discuss about the specs and discuss about the scaling plans and how fast you're scaling. And I think it's also important for both sides, for a DAC company to have multiple outlets of the CO2. For sure, with advantages of permanent mineralization with CO2 credits, but also in Holland, I'm Dutch, greenhouses is a very big market, but also for mineralization plants or the storage people to have multiple DAC units options, because I can imagine a place where there's sufficient renewable energy, you have another type of storage than another type of DAC unit than a place where there's less renewable energy, or where maybe there's sufficient heat available or sufficient electrical power available. That will determine also which kind of technology fits the best.
So you definitely see the future that Paul from Carbon Atlantis is talking about, and you also see a world where essentially there's hubs, your storage hubs with
Yeah.
like director capture companies all co-locating there
Yeah.
in large part
Or
to
co-locating
minimize
or
transport.
yeah, or co-locating or shipping it there. In Iceland, there are really serious plans already to ship CO2 to Iceland. And then, of course, yeah, we can, of course, ship the fossil CO2 to Iceland to store it as a geological CCS storage. But as you know, the the fossil CO2 will be lowered anyway due to more renewable energy. And of course, as we all are aware from CO2 removal. So these kind of project developments and bigger intermediate, which take care of the transportation unit. In Holland, we have a Porters project starting. At this moment, is only focused on CO2 from Shell and another chemical plant storing below North Sea. But in the future, I can for sure see, let's say, the options that we take the CO2 from this CO2 pipeline and other DAC companies supply the CO2 to the same pipeline, therefore making truly a hub.
Yeah, makes sense. Cooper and Claire, just curious if you see the kind of future that the Pauls are talking about, or if that's not what you think is going to happen. Is curious.
I wish I had a crystal ball. I think
I
we'll
know,
see a
right?
variety of commercial arrangements. Kind of, the market will figure out what works best for everybody. And I think good comments from both folks there. I think one thing to touch on is that transportation has come up several times throughout all of this. And if you're looking at future development and co-locating facilities, that's maybe less of an issue. But underlying those potential locations is a lot of the same factors for both companies, and that's going to be the carbon intensity of power, which we've heard a bunch about. DAC companies, some are more dependent on different kind of atmospheric conditions than others, and then ultimately geologic storage solutions like ours and like Claire's, you can't move any of those rocks. The geology is where the geology is. So figuring out, again, tying into that first question, making sure that your partner company aligns with kind of your geographic needs is a big piece of that puzzle. And right now we live in a world where, especially on the CCS side, transportation is a big piece of it, because those facilities that are emitting already exist. That captured CO2 then needs to be transported somewhere. But for a lot of the DAC things that we're talking about for future development, or you can look at co-locating these facilities in the most beneficial fashion that requires hopefully the least energy and has the lowest carbon intensity energy.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add other
No
than
worries.
that the only reason at the moment that we're not trying to sell, well, we're not, but not like chasing down pre-purchases and stuff, is mostly a bandwidth issue. Like, being a small technology startup, we need to focus on our technology. So again, as a storage company, we kind of have the luxury of having multiple DAC companies way outnumber storage companies. So we can just rely on DAC companies to kind of search for buyers and customers and come to us. But who's to say that that might totally flip in the future? I don't know.
I want to go back to the transportation issue that people have mentioned a couple of times, because, yes, you can like put CO2 on trucks and truck it around up to a certain scale, but then that is not going to work eventually, right? And so in several cases, I mean, even maybe before that, you're dealing with infrastructure building, right? And Paul from Paebbl, you mentioned that like y'all are setting up for being able to support smaller kind of testing sites, pilot sites for director capture companies. So like, I guess my question is like, who's responsible for all that infrastructure? Like, if you have to build a pipeline, who pays for that? And how does that factor into the cost and the negotiation and all of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to consider, and that's I think one of the challenges that a lot of these companies face is that these are infrastructure projects. It's not, it's not software or anything like that. They're large scale projects with large scale capex that includes, could be billions of dollars for pipelines, things like that. So how does that totally get separated out into those commercial agreements and arrangements is very, very challenging. And you're starting with in that case with, you're talking that size numbers, you're looking at very, very large potential customers with very, very large pocketbooks and very, very large emissions needs or capture needs. That's ultimately challenging. And I think what I'd tie that into, though, is I think one of the most important pieces for all of this, because of that infrastructure requirements for this, is that local community engagement. I saw that pop up in the chat, and I think that's really, really important, because for DAC and for storage, because of the infrastructure size of these projects, if you don't have that local community on board with what you're doing immediately, you're going to have some real challenges, and it won't matter who's going to pay for it ultimately if you can't build it.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. So it sounds like in community engagement, environmental justice piece is a really, really big thing that wasn't spoken about earlier, but is important for both companies as part of their selection process. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
And there's a huge opportunity for environmental justice and social justice to come out of a lot of this work, but it's going to take a lot of heavy lifting on the ground, and it's heavy lifting right now that's being done by small startups, which is challenging.
Yeah, usually not the ideal to be doing the heavy lifting. Yeah, absolutely. Clara, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say about the infrastructure. I mean, like Paul from Carbon Atlantis said, we're all kind of serving as project developers right now for our first projects, just to move quickly and de-risk our technology. But ideally, at least for us, that we're also all technology companies. Hopefully that won't be the case forever, and project developers will see the opportunity here and step in and handle the infrastructure building, the permitting, the community engagement, so that we can all fundamentally focus on what we do at the core, which is technology. And it's kind of unfortunate that there's such a huge CDR ecosystem and so much support and so many enthusiastic kind of ecosystem companies and partners and platforms and everything, but it still feels like startups could use a lot of help with the project development things. Like if there were kind of nonprofits that would come in and help us with community engagement, or like with kind of that sort of stuff, that would be incredibly helpful, because it is, like Cooper said, a huge burden to carry right now to develop a technology and develop a project and do it in an equitable and beneficial and environmentally positive way for everybody, and also sell the credits. It's just that's hopefully not going to be the setup forever. So the question of who splits the revenue and everything will evolve, and who pays for infrastructure. It probably already is different for later stage DAC companies. Like I'm sure that Climeworks and Heirloom and the later stage companies that are doing a DAC hubs and actually talking about pipelines and stuff right now would have different answers than we do, because there are other partners on those big projects. So hopefully that's just how it will be later, and that people will help, because I think ideally none of us in this room want to be figuring out infrastructure and transport stuff.
Yeah.
Ever.
Never. Yeah. I mean, that brings up like a really interesting kind of thing that we're starting to see now, Ellen. Like I'm just thinking about Deep Sky, right, which is a public-private partnership, and really like the development of that. And I'm curious if y'all think that that's kind of the model that y'all are going to have to end up kind of going down, like that's the route you're going to end up having to go down, or if you think that there's going to be more than that option as the way to do it. Because Claire, I could hear like, there's real want and real need for the project developer side of the house to really come in. So I'm curious how you all think about what's happening with Deep Sky in Canada.
Yeah, I think that it would be like our strong preference at Cella to work with project developers like Deep Sky. It just makes sense. Like no big infrastructure project ever in the history of industries is really done by the technology company usually. I mean, like that, especially in a new industry, if you look at oil and gas value chains, like there's so many different partners. It's not just like Chevron that's like, we're going to drill here and do everything. Like they have drilling contractors, they have seismic contractors. There's like 50 different companies that come in to develop that thing. And that, like, we need that for this industry to get to scale and to be impactful and to be economical. So I would love to see more project developer companies like Deep Sky pop up, because as of right now, the only people that are serving those roles are oil and gas companies. And there are also a lot of DAC companies that don't want to work with oil and gas companies. So it's, really easy to squash an early stage technology start by expecting them to do what a multi-billion-dollar oil and gas company can do. So I don't know.
Great points. Paul?
One thing to add to that, I also think it's a good development and good to see that a company like Deep Sky pops up, because I think it's really important for the industry itself to grow. And as you said, Adina, it's public and private, so I think it's important it should go hand in hand. So you also need a public support if it's pipelines or grid infrastructure. You may want to have a big source of energy that's often controlled by public energy companies. If it's hydropower, or I mean, it doesn't have to be, but often you have some, communities involved, and I think it's good to see and good development, definitely, because in the end it's a totally different business what Deep Sky will do than what we do day to day in our company.
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like that's the prediction, is that eventually, like, and you're already starting to see this with some of the larger larger storage companies, is that their customers ultimately are the project developers, right? Versus right now, your customers are kind of director capture companies, kind of, right? So big mover.
I mean,
I want
to just touch on that quickly, Adina, and say that, I think that's one important consideration here is when you think of the scale of these projects, when everyone's successful and everyone's doing millions of tons per year, like all of these are billion-dollar projects, and there's only a few people capable of writing checks that size, and it's probably governments, oil and gas companies, mining companies, and insurance companies. And there's not a whole heap of other billion-dollar infrastructure project kind of corporations out there, entities out there. And whether or not you want to get in bed with energy companies or anything like that, like skipping that whole thing, what is key to take away from that is the people that they have managing those projects can manage these projects. And so building that project development infrastructure that Claire alluded to, with all the contractors, all the supply chains, everything like that, is going to be really, really key to scaling up any of these techs. And the expertise exists. We just need to pull it into this space that we're working in.
It's great future prediction happening here on this panel. I want to open it up for Q&A. Jason, I know that you're running that whole show, so please queue up who we've got first.
Sure, lots of questions coming in, lots of really interesting comments in the chat as well, so thank you for all that. PK Powell, if you are still in the room, would love to see if you can unmute and ask a question about insurance.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, great. Yeah, so my question was between the DAC and the storage companies, how are you distributing insurance risks? Is it dependent on who's selling the credit to market, and how is that being handled in your contracts?
I can start out on that one. It depends on what type of insurance you're talking about. If it's carbon insurance against physical risks, I think for that one, both companies would insure the assets that they own. So whether it's the DAC machines or the storage infrastructure. If it's more about the carbon insurance, and mostly now towards the buyers, especially where they are making prepayments for future delivery of credits, that insurance is generally paid by the buyer, and it can be tacked on as a product that the carbon rights holder is selling with the buyer, but the buyer ultimately pays for that. And basically, the way that works is that ultimately they are made whole if there are any project execution risks that come to fruition and the credits are not delivered, contracted credits are not delivered.
Great, thanks. Anyone else on the panel want to comment?
In our case, Paul, we didn't even discuss the insurance risk, but let's say in our case it's slightly different because we know at the end of the day how much CO2 we sequestered because the whole process runs in a chemical reactor. So that's a bit different. There's no, after the reaction has been finished, there is no risk of leakage in DTS. So that puts us a bit outside the other storage companies. But we didn't even think about it being honestly in the contract with Frontiers about these kind of things. So it's,
I'm just curious, show of hands for the panel, like how many of you got insurance for your own infrastructure? Okay, like one. Okay, got it. Two. Okay. How many of you got insurance, kind of the way that Duncan was talking about for credit delivery? Okay, got it. Yeah. And it sounds like you can, yeah.
Adina, a lot of this insurance, we've spoken to a few insurance companies, and a lot of these are products that are still under development. So
yeah.
It's not something you can necessarily find off the shelf. A lot of these insurance companies that are in carbon finance or carbon insurance specifically are developing these projects right now, or these products right now, sorry.
Yeah, helpful.
I think that, well, oh, sorry. Just wanted to kind of reiterate something Duncan already said, but for your last question, Adina, the insurance for the credit delivery is something that the buyer would get, not the supplier. So, and those are the products that Duncan was talking about that aren't really in development yet. And that pretty much just like the only people working on this right now are Kita, pretty much. Natalia Dorfman's like innovative and really a visionary in this space. And it's really just like Paul was saying, like insurance based on the likelihood of that credit never being delivered.
Yes.
So in some ways, like the quality of the credit is baked into that, but that's something that the buyer would get.
Yes. Makes sense.
And we've spoken with insurance groups and advisors that are worried that we know that all of the major insurance associations and companies are thinking about how they'll manage these projects. And that comes down to everything from credit delivery to, risks of leakage or environmental, risks and all these kinds of things. Like they are thinking about it. They do know it's something they need to sort out. It's just, again, that nascent industry. And especially as we start to think outside of kind of the traditional, we've been sticking carbon underground in oil and gas reservoirs for decades. So thinking outside of that box and making risk assessments there. And as Claire alluded to, hopefully mineralization is viewed as lower risk, and that is a higher quality thing. And we can reduce costs that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Jason, do we have another question lined up?
Yeah, another question. Graham Andrews, if you're in the house, if you want to unmute and ask. If not, I can. If not, if you don't feel comfortable, I can ask. Yep. Here you go, Graham. Please go ahead. It looks like a question got upvoted by a couple of people, so
okay.
Go for it.
So do the panelists think that DAC companies and storage, when they're combined in a project, will scale at the same rate, or is DAC going to scale faster than the storage can keep up? I guess another way to ask that question is, as a project matures, or as a DAC company matures, are we going to see more partnerships like Oxy and Carbon Engineering?
Who wants to take that?
I take it. I think in short, I would say that storage is going to scale faster. Right now, DAC like outpaces storage in terms of like the number of startups and the dollars of investments going into it and the transactions associated with pre-purchases and whatnot. But it's just a matter of mass balance, pretty much, as you very well know, Graham. Like yeah, once you have a project site, a site's not going to be developed if it's not in the millions of tons capacity, frankly, at all. And DAC's not going to scale quickly enough to fill that. I think that storage, in some places, there's going to be competition. I'm hesitant to say competition because that sounds like kind of an aggressive way to say it, but obviously a good amount of the storage capacity and infrastructure and pipelines and networks set up for that are going to also be taken up by CCS, point sources. So in terms of how it's going to play out with deploying the massively greater storage capacity relative to DAC capture capacity and how that actually works long term, fitting the DAC into networks and developing new storage sites, like, remains to be seen. But yeah, I think short answer, I would say storage is gonna move more quickly.
Yeah, and also let's say storage can also be used for fossil CO2 storage in DTS. In Holland, we have this Porters project, and of course we use old oil and gas fields. So quite of the storage will be used by just simple fossil CO2. Yeah, as simple as that, because there is a huge amount of CO2 already emitted, and there are all kind of infrastructure projects, for instance, Sweden capturing CO2 and then putting in a ship, and the project Green Sand in Denmark to unload CO2. So there will be lots of storage available for fossil CO2 already being developed. But of course, that's mainly oil and gas fields. I realized that.
Anybody have a
Yeah.
differing opinion about like storage
I do.
scaling faster? You do. Tell me
Yeah.
all about it, Sean.
Yeah, I think this is like super nuanced first. If you look at it, like, I guess technologically, it's imagine if you had like a DAC plant and you just keep scaling it larger and larger in one spot. You'd have to do something kind of like what Shell has in Alberta, that you'd have to keep putting additional holes in the ground as you keep going further and further, because there's only so much pore space down in the ground, but there's unlimited CO2 that'll pass over that area. So at the largest scales, maybe you could say DAC would be the one that'd be able to scale easiest. On the flip side, it's super nuanced because, like, in some ways, storage in the immediate, it can be really quick. But then you're dealing with like interesting hurdles and whatnot. Like in Canada, you don't own the pore space, even if you own the land on top of it and stuff like that. So you have to get the government to then approve it. And if you're going to increase that storage space, you have to get them to approve that. So now it's a regulatory thing holding you up. With direct air capture, it's going to be a very similar thing, right? Like, we're going to be wanting to put a plant down there. How does the community feel about it? That's going to be super visible in some senses. It's a little less scary than, like, there's CO2 being put in the ground, but we're going to have to then, somehow get more renewable energy to that spot. It's in some ways, I would like to say that it was a clear-cut answer in my mind, but I really see it as something that's not, it's not easy to say one or the other in my mind.
Cooper, looks like you want to weigh in.
Yeah, no, I think Sean brings up an interesting point on two interesting points. And one is that, yeah, in the short and medium term, certainly that regulatory environment is a very, I don't want to say volatile, but it's an ever-changing kind of ecosystem. And that depends on, again, kind of going back to thinking about those layers and those geographies and where your product is maybe most viable. It could change tomorrow because some country could potentially change their regulations and make that the best place to be. That'll evolve and that'll change, and I think everything will kind of catch up. But I think the other aspect of it, especially on the DAC side, that's important to consider is that energy consumption issue, and that as all of these, there's some pretty interesting projections, I guess, for the amount of energy required to scale DAC in the way that we need to under kind of the IPCC reporting and things like that. And those energy requirements are enormous, and that's something we're going to have to wrestle with in the medium to long term. So I'm with Claire. I think storage scales the best because we're a storage company, but overall, that energy requirement for this whole process is something that we're going to have to wrestle with and figure out.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I want to make sure that we get one last question that was like massively upvoted in, and it's going to have to be quick takes because we have 4 minutes left. So Jason, if you wouldn't mind reading out the MRV question real quick.
Yeah. I mean, Jordan DeVries asked, how can we get help with robust MRV for mineral carbonates created through XC2 mineralization? I think Adam Gordon asked something earlier about, Cooper's.
Yeah, we're going to do.
I think Adam Gordon asked something about similar to that earlier. So, and a couple of different people upvoted it. So, MRV, it's a carbon removal, it's a carbon removal event. So, got to ask about MRV. Check the box.
and quickly and briefly, if you would, Cooper.
We're involved in a project with the Department of Energy that's looking to develop a robust MRV protocol for both ex situ and in situ mineralization.
Okay. If you want to learn more, Cooper's email is going to be in the follow-up from this event. All right. Any other hot takes? Yeah.
I can say that the in situ, that's a little easier.
In situ
That's a little easier.
Yeah. Ex situ's complicated. Okay. All right.
I would disagree with
Cooper
that.
disagrees. And so
I would
does Claire.
disagree as well.
Just weigh in.
Getting dicey here in the last minute. Yeah, just quickly, and then we got to.
Ex situ, you can just pick it up and measure it. In situ, down in the ground somewhere. It's much harder.
Claire,
Yeah,
you agree? Okay, great. All
Great.
right.
All right, everyone. So thank you for an excellent conversation, everybody. This really moved the discussion forward. Thank you, Adina, for moderating. Thank you to all our panelists for joining. Thank you, especially to our audience, for having such excellent questions for the panel and for your time and attention, most importantly. To that end, I've added the, regrettably, we weren't able to get to all the questions, so I've added the speaker contact information in the chat, as well as a link to our post-event survey. Please let us know any feedback, good, bad, or indifferent. We want to know how we can make events better for you, our audience, in our community. So there's that. Next event, in just over a week, we're talking to the National Energy Technology Lab, and in the United States, representatives from there are going to be talking about questions from you, our community, about how to work with them, particularly in regard to direct air capture projects that that you've got, that NETL can help out with in any way, shape, or form. So with that, I just want to say once again, thank you. Like I said, answer our survey. We'd love to see you next week for our next event. And then after that, we've got the Carbies for those of us you who are in our Slack community. So, the official tease is going to go out soon for that.